Chapter 109. Near the fence row that flanked the main road, Irene was busily picking leaves to press into dry perfumes when she looked up, hearing the sound of a galloping horse's hoofs. She gasped, seeing the horseman wearing a flowing green scarf and a black derby with a curving rooster-tail feather jutting up from the hatband. Waving her arms wildly, she raced toward the road, crying out at the top of her lungs, "Chicken George! Chicken George!" The rider reined up just beyond the fence, his lathered horse heaving with relief. "Do I know you, gal?" he called, returning her smile. "Naw, sir, we ain't never seen one another, but Tom, Mammy, Tilda, and de family talk about you so much I knows what you look like." He stared at her. "My Tom and Tilda?" "Yas, sir, yo' wife and my husband, my baby's daddy." It took him a few seconds to register it. "You and Tom got a chile?" She nodded, beaming and patting her protruding stomach. "It due another month." He shook his head. Lord God Almighty! What's your name?" "Irene, sir." Telling him to ride on, she hurried clumsily as fast as she dared until she reached within vocal range of where Virgil, Ashford, Lil George, James, Lewis, Lil Kizzy, and Lily Sue were planting in another section of the plantation. Her loud hallooing quickly brought a worried Lil Kizzy, who raced back to relay the incredible news. They all breathlessly reached the slave row, shouting and surging about their father, mother, and Tom, and all trying at once to embrace him, until a pummeled and disarrayed Chicken George was entirely overwhelmed with his reception. "Guess best y'all hears the bad news first," he told them, and then of the deaths of Grandmammy Kizzy and Sister Sarah. Ol' Mrs. Leah, she gone too. When their griefs at their losses had abated somewhat, he described Miss Melizzy's condition, and then his experience with Massa Leah, finally resulting in the freedom paper that he triumphantly displayed. Supper was eaten, and the night fell upon the family grouped raptly about him as he entered the topic of his nearly 5 years in England. "Gonna tell y'all the truth, reckon I'd need 'nother year try and tell all I seed and done over way crossed all that water. My Lawd!" But he gave them now at least a few highlights of Sir C. Eric Russell's great wealth and social prestige, of his long purebred lineage and consistently winning game flock, and how as an expert black trainer from America he had proved fascinating to lovers of gamecocking in England, where fine ladies would go strolling, leading their small African boys dressed in silks and velvet by golden chains about their necks. "Ain't gonna lie, I's glad I had all the 'speriences I is, but Lawd knows I missed y'all somepin terrible." "Sho don't look it to me, stretchin' 2 years out to mo and fo," Matilda snapped. "Ol' Biddy ain't changed a bit, is she?" observed Chicken George to his amused children. "Huh! Who's so ol'?" Matilda shot back. "Yo' head done got to showin' mo gray dan mine is." He laughingly patted Matilda's shoulder as she feigned great indignance. "'Twant me ain't wanted to get back. I commence mindin' Lawd Russell soon's dem 2 years done. But one day after a while he come and say I's trainin' his chicken so good, well as the young white feller was my helper, dat he done 'cided send 'nudder sum of money to Massa Leah, tellin' him he need me 1 mo' year. And I nearly had a fit. But what I'm goin' to do? Done de best I could. I got in his letter from Massa Leah be showin' explainin' to y'all what happened." "He ain't tole us nary word!" exclaimed Matilda, and Tom spoke. "You know why? He done sol us off by dat time." "Sho right, it's why us ain't heerd." See? 'Twarn't me." Chicken George sounded pleased to be vindicated. After his bitter disappointment, he said he had extracted Sir Russell's pledge that it would be the last year. "Den I went head and helped his chickens win dey biggest season ever. Least dat's what he told me. Den finally he said he feel like I done teach the young white feller enough dat he could take over, and I just 'bout lit up dat place carryin' on. I was so happy. Let me tell y'all somethin'. It's a mighty few ever has 2 whole carriage loads of English folks companyin' 'em like they did me, to Southampton. That's great big city by de water, wid ain't no tellin' how many ships goin' in and out. Lawd Russell had ranged for me ridin' steerage in dis ship 'cross de ocean. Lawd, de scaredest I ever been. We ain't got all dat far out there fo' commence to buckin' and rearin' like a wild hoss. Talk 'bout prayin'," he ignored Matilda's "Seemed like the whole ocean gone crazy. trying to wrench us to pieces. But then finally it came down pretty fair, and it was even restful by time we come to New York, where everybody got off. New York! Little Kizzy exclaimed. What you do there, Pappy? Gal, ain't I tellin' it fast as I can? Well, Lord Russell had give one to ship officers money with 'structions to put me on another ship that'd get me to Richmond. But the ship the officer made arrangement with weren't leavin' fo 5-6 days, so I just walked up and down in that New York, listenin' and lookin'. Where you stay at? Asked Matilda. Roomin' house for colored. That's same as... Where you think? I had money. I got money. Out in my saddlebags right now. Gonna show it to y'all in the mornin'. He glanced devilishly at Matilda. Might even give you $100, you act right. As she snorted, he went on. That Lord Russell turned out to be a real good man. Give me this pretty fair piece of money just 'fo I left. Say it's strictly for me, not even to mention it to Massa Leah. And you knows for sure I ain't. Really main thing I done was talk with plenty of them New York free. Seem like to me most of 'em tryin' to keep from starvin', worse off'n we is. But it is like we's heerd. Some of 'em is livin' good. Got different kinds they own businesses or nice payin' jobs. Few owns they own homes, and more pays rents in somethin' they calls apartments, and some of the young'uns gettin' some schoolin' sich as that. But whatever I talk to mad as yellow jackets 'bout as all them migratin' white folks everywhere you looks. Them abolitions, yelped Lil Kizzy, you tellin' it or me? Nah, sho ain't. Way I understand, the abolitions is pret much white folks, what been in dis country least long as is. But these I speakin' 'bout is pilin' off in ships into New York. In fact, all over the North. They's Irishers, mainly. You can't understand what they's sayin'. And lot o' other peculiar kinds can't even speak English. Fact, I heard they steps off the ships and first word they learns is... Then next thing they's claimin' takin' day jobs. They's startin' fights and riots all the time. They's worser 'n po' white folks. Well, Lord, I hope they stays away from down here, said Irene. Look here, y'all, it'd take me another week to tell half the goin's on I seed and heerd 'fo that ship brung me to Richmond. Surprise to me you even got on it. Woman, ain't you goin' never let me lone? Man gone for years, and you actin' like I left yesterday. The slightest suggestion of an edge was in Chicken George's voice. Tom asked quickly, You bought your hoss in Richmond? That's right, $70. She a real fast speckle mare. I figured free man gonna need a good hoss. I rid her hard as she could stand it to Massa Leah's. It being early April, everyone else was extremely busy. Most of the family were in the planting season's height. Among cleaning, cooking, and serving in the big house, Matilda had very little available free time. Tom's customers kept him going at his hardest from daylight into deepening dusk, and the nearly 8 months pregnant Irene was scarcely less occupied among her diverse tasks. No matter, across the next week, Chicken George visited with them all, but out in the fields it soon was as uncomfortably clear to them as to himself that he and anything connected with field work were alien. Matilda and Irene's faces made quick smiles when he came near. Then they made equally quick apologies that they knew he understood that they had to get back to what they were doing. Several times he dropped by to have some chat with Tom while he blacksmithed, but each time the atmosphere would grow tense. The slaves who were waiting grew visibly nervous on seeing whatever as yet unattended white customers abruptly quit their conversations, spit emphatically, and shift their bodies about on the log benches, while eyeing the wearer of the green scarf and the black derby with obvious silent suspicion. Twice during these times, Tom happened to glance and see Massa Murray starting down toward the shop, then turn back, and Tom knew why. Matilda had said that when the Murrays first learned of Chicken George's arrival, "They seem happy for us, but Tom, I worries. I know they since had they heads together whole lot, then quits talkin' soon's I comes in." What was going to be Chicken George's free status there on the Murray plantation? What was he going to do? The questions hung like a cloud in the minds of every individual among them, excepting Virgil's and Lily Sue's 4-year-old Uriah. Use my grandpappy? Uriah seized his chance to say something directly to the intriguing man who had seemed to occasion such a stir among all of the other adults ever since his arrival several days before. What? The startled Chicken George had just wandered back into the slave row, deeply rankled by his feeling of being rejected. He eyed the child, who stared at him with large, curious eyes. Well, reckon I is. About to walk on, George turned. What dey say yo name? Uriah, sah. Grandpappy, whereabouts you work at? What you talking about? He glared down at the boy. Who told you to ax me dat? Nobody. Just ax you. He decided that the boy told the truth. Don't work nowheres. I's free. The boy hesitated. Grandpappy, what free is? Feeling ridiculous, standing there being interrogated by a youngin', Chicken George started on, but then he thought of what Matilda had confided of the boy. Seemed like he tend to be sickly, even maybe a little quare in the head. Next time you round him, notice how he apt to just keep staring at somebody even after they's quit talking. Turning about, Chicken George searched the face of Uriah, and he saw what Matilda meant. The boy did project an impression of physical weakness, and, except for his blinking, the large eyes were as if they had fastened onto Chicken George, assessing his every utterance or movement. George felt uncomfortable. The boy repeated his question. Suh, what free is? Free mean ain't nobody own you no mo'. He had a sense that he was speaking to the eyes. He started off again. Mammy say you fights chickens. What you fight 'em wid? Wheeling about, a retort on his tongue, Chicken George perceived the earnest, curious face of only a small boy, and it stirred something within him. Grandchild. Critically, he studied Uriah, thinking that there must be something appropriate to say to him, and finally, yo mammy or anybody told you where you comes from? Suh? Comes from where? He had not been told, Chicken George saw, or if he had, not in a way that he remembered. Come on along with me here, boy. Also, it was something for him to do. Followed by Uriah, Chicken George led the way over to the cabin that he was sharing with Matilda. Now set yo'self down in dat chair and don't be axin' no whole lot of questions. Just set and listen to what I tells you. Yassa, yo pappy born of me and yo grandmammy Tilda. He eyed the boy. You understands dat? My pappy y'all youngin'. Dat's right. You ain't dumb as you looks. Den my mammy named Kizzy. So she yo great-grandmammy. Grandmammy Kizzy. Say dat. Yassa, Grandmammy Kizzy. Yeah, den her mammy named Belle. He looked at the boy. Name Belle. Chicken George grunted. All right. And Kizzy's pappy named Kunta Kinte. Kunta Kinte. Dat's right. Well, him and Belle yo great-great-grandfolks. Nearly an hour later, when Matilda came hurrying nervously into the cabin, wondering what on earth had happened to Uriah, she found him dutifully repeating such sounds as Kunta Kinte and Ko and Kambi Bolungo, and Matilda decided that she had the time to sit down, and beaming with satisfaction she listened as Chicken George told their rapt grandson the story of how his African great-great-granddaddy had said he was not far from his village, chopping some wood to make a drum, when he had been surprised, overwhelmed, and stolen into slavery by 4 men. Then a ship brung him across the big water to a place called Napolis, and he was bought there by a Massa John Waller, what took him to his plantation that was in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. The following Monday, Chicken George rode with Tom in the mule cart to buy supplies in the county seat town of Graham. Little was said between them, each seeming mostly immersed in his own thoughts. As they went from one to another store, Chicken George keenly relished the quiet dignity with which his 27-year-old son dealt with the various white merchants. Then they went into a feed store that Tom said had recently been bought by a former county sheriff named J.D. Cates. The heavy-set Cates was seeming to ignore them as he moved about serving his few white customers. Some sense of warning rose within Tom. Glancing, he saw Cates looking covertly at the green-scarfed, black-derbied Chicken George, who was stepping about in a cocky manner, visually inspecting items of merchandise. Intuitively, Tom was heading toward his father to accomplish a quick exit when Cates' voice cut through the store. "Hey, boy, fetch me a dipper of water from that bucket over there." Cates was gazing directly at Tom, the eyes taunting, menacing. Tom's insides congealed as, under the threat of a white man's direct order, he walked stony-faced to the bucket and returned with a dipper of water. Cates drank it at a gulp, his small eyes over the dipper's rim now on Chicken George, who stood with his head slowly shaking. Cates thrust the dipper toward him. "I'm still thirsty." Avoiding any quick moves, Chicken George drew from his pocket his carefully folded freedom paper and handed it to Cates. Kate's unfolded it and read. "What are you doing in our county?" he asked coldly. "He my pappy," Tom put in quickly. Above all, he did not want his father attempting any defiant talk. He'd just been given his freedom. "Livin' with y'all now at Mr. Murray's place?" "Yassa." Glancing about his white customers, Kate's exclaimed, "Mr. Murray ought to know the laws of this state better'n that." Uncertain what he meant, neither Tom nor George said anything. Suddenly, Kate's manner was almost affable. "Well, when y'all boys get home, be sure to tell Mr. Murray I'll be out to talk with him 'fore long." With the sound of white men's laughter behind them, Tom and Chicken George quickly left the store. It was the next afternoon when Kate's galloped down the driveway of the Murray big house. A few minutes later, Tom glanced up from his forge and saw Irene running toward the shop. Hurrying past his few waiting customers, he went to meet her. "Mammy Tilda say let you know Massa and dat white man on de porch steady talkin'. Least the man keep talkin' and Massa just noddin' and noddin'." "All right, honey," said Tom. "Don't be scairt. You get on back now." Irene fled. Then, after about another half hour, she brought word that Kate had left, and now Massa and Mrs. got their heads together. But nothing happened until Matilda was serving supper to Massa and Mrs. Murray, whom she saw were eating in a strained silence. Finally, when she brought their dessert and coffee, Massa Murray said in a tight voice, "Matilda, tell your husband I want to see him out on the porch right away." "Yassa, Massa." She found Chicken George with Tom down at the blacksmith shop. Chicken George forced a laugh when he got the message. "Reckon he might want to see if I'm getting some fightin' roosters." Adjusting his scarf and tilting his derby to a jauntier angle, he walked briskly toward the big house. Massa Murray was waiting there, seated in a rocker on the porch. Chicken George stopped in the yard at the foot of the stairs. "Tilda say you wants to see me, sir." "Yes, I do, George. I'll come right to the point. Your family has brought Mrs. Murray and me much happiness here." "Yassa," George put in. "And they show speaks the highest of y'all too, Massa." The Massa firmed his voice. "But I'm afraid we're going to have to solve a problem concerning you." He paused. "I understand that in Burlington yesterday you met Mr. J.D. Cates, our former county sheriff." "Yassa, reckon could say I met him, yassa." "Well, you probably know Mr. Cates has visited me today. He brought to my attention a North Carolina law that forbids any free black man from staying within the state for more than 60 days, or he must be re-enslaved." It took a moment to sink in. Chicken George stared disbelievingly at Massa Murray. He couldn't speak. "I'm really sorry, boy. I know it don't seem fair to you." "Do it seem fair to you, Massa Murray?" The Massa hesitated. "No, to tell you the truth. But the law is the law." He paused. "But if you would want to choose to stay here, I'll guarantee you'll be treated well. You have my word on that." "Yo word, Massa Murray." George's eyes were impassive. That night, George and Matilda lay under their quilt, hands touching, both staring up at the ceiling. "Tilda," he said after a long while, "guess ain't nothing to do but stay. Seem like runnin's all I ever done." "Nah, George." She shook her head slowly back and forth. "'Cause you the first one us ever free. You gotta stay free. So us have somebody free in this family. You just can't go back to being a slave." Chicken George began to cry, and Matilda was weeping with him. 2 evenings later, she was not feeling well enough to join him in having supper with Tom and Irene in their small cabin. The conversation turned to their child, which was due within 2 weeks, and Chicken George grew solemn. "Be sure y'all tells that child about our family. Y'all hear me? Pappy, ain't none my chillens gonna grow old without knowin'." Tom strained a smile. "I reckon if I don't tell him, Grandmammy Kizzy come back to set me straight." There was a silence for a while as the 3 of them sat staring at the fire. Finally, Chicken George spoke again. "Me and Tilda was countin' I got 40 more days 'fore I has to leave, 'cordin' to what the laws say. But I been thinkin' ain't no good time to go. Ain't no point keep just puttin' off." He sprang up from his chair, fiercely embracing Tom and Irene. "I be back," he rasped brokenly. "Take care one another." He bolted through the door. Chapter 110. It was early in November of 1860, and Tom was hurrying to finish his last blacksmithing task before darkness fell. He made it. Then, banking the fire in his forge, he trudged wearily home to have supper with Irene, who was nursing their baby girl, Maria, now half a year old. But they ate wordlessly, because Irene elected not to interrupt his thoughtful silence, and afterward they joined the rest of the family crowded into Matilda's cabin, cracking and shelling hickory nuts that she and Irene, who was again pregnant, had been collecting for use in the special cakes and pies they planned to bake for Christmas and New Year's. Tom sat listening to the light conversation without comment, or even seeming to hear, and then finally, during a lull, he leaned forward in his chair and spoke. "Y'all 'member different times I said white man's talking round my shop done been cussin' and carry on 'bout dat Massa Lincoln? Well, wish y'all coulda heard him today, 'cause he been 'lected president. Dey claim now he gon' be up there in the White House 'gainst the South and anybody keepin' slaves." "Well," said Matilda, "I be primed to hear whatever Massa Murray got to say 'bout it. He sho been steady tellin' Missus gonna be big trouble lessen the North and South get dey differences settled, one way or 'nother." "Different things I've heard," Tom went on. "Whole lots mo' folks than we thinks is 'gainst slavin'. Ain't all of 'em up North, neither. I couldn't hardly keep my mind on what I was doin' today. I been studyin' on it so hard. Seem like too much to believe, but it could come a day won't be no mo' slaves." "Well, we sho won't live to see it," said Ashford sourly. "But maybe she will," said Virgil, nodding toward Irene's baby. "Don't seem likely," said Irene, "much as I like to believe it. You put together all the slaves in the South, would even just field hands bringin' $800 and $900 apiece? That's mo' money'n God's got. Plus that, we does all the work." She looked at Tom. "You know white folks ain't gonna give dat up." "Not without a fight," said Ashford. "And dey's lots more of dem than us. So how we gonna win?" "But if you ain't talkin' 'bout the whole country," said Tom, "it might be just many folks 'gainst slavery as fo' it." "Trouble is dem what's 'gainst it ain't here where we is," Virgil said, and Ashford nodded, agreeing with someone for a change. "Well, if an Ashford right 'bout a fight, all dat could change real fast," said Tom. In early December, soon after Massa and Mrs. Murray returned home in their buggy from dinner at a neighboring big house one night, Matilda hurried from the big house to Tom and Irene's cabin. "What do seceded mean?" she asked, and when they shrugged their shoulders, she went on. "Well, Massa says dat's what South Caroliny just done. Massa sound like it mean dey's pullin' out in United States." "How dey gon' pull out the country dey's in?" Tom said. "White folks do anythin'," said Irene. Tom hadn't told them, but throughout the day he had been listening to his white customers fuming that they would be wading knee-deep in blood before they'd give in to the North on something they called states' rights, along with the right to own slaves. "I ain't wanted to scare y'all none," he told Matilda and Irene, "but I really believes it gon' be a war." "Oh my Lord! Whereabouts it gon' be, Tom?" "Mammy, ain't no special war grounds, like church or picnic grounds." "Well, I sho hope don't be nowhere round here." Irene scoffed at them both. "Don't y'all ax me to believe no white folks gonna get to killing one another over." But as the days passed, the things Tom overheard at his shop convinced him that he was right. Some of it he told his family about, but some not, for he didn't want to alarm them unnecessarily. And he hadn't decided himself whether he dreaded the events he saw coming or hoped for them. But he could sense the family's uneasiness increasing anyway, along with the traffic on the main road, as white riders and buggies raced back and forth past the plantation faster and faster and in ever-growing numbers. Almost every day someone would turn into the driveway and engage Massa Murray in conversation. Matilda employed every ruse to mop and dust where she could listen in. And slowly, over the next few weeks, in the nightly family exchanges, the white people's frightened, angry talk gradually encouraged all of them to dare to believe that if there was a war and the Yankees won, it was just possible that they might really be set free. An increasing number of the blacks who delivered blacksmithing jobs to Tom told him that their masses and missies were becoming suspicious and secretive, lowering their voices and even spelling out words when even their oldest and closest servants entered a room. "Is dey's actin' anyways culiar in de big house round you, Mammy?" Tom asked Matilda. "Not no whisperin' or spellin' or such as dat," she said, "but dey sho is done commenced to shift off sudden to talkin' 'bout crops or dinner parties just soon's I come in." "Best thing for us all to do," said Tom, "is act dumb as we can, like we ain't even heard 'bout what goin' on." Matilda considered that, but decided against it. And one evening, after she had served the Murrays their desserts, she came into the dining room and exclaimed, wringing her hands, "Lord, Mass and Missy, y'all 'scuse me. Just got to say my chillins and me is hearin' all this talk goin' round, and we be's mighty scared o' dem Yankees, and we sho hopes you gonna take care of us, if in day's trouble." With satisfaction she noted the swift expressions of approval and relief crossing their faces. "Well, you're right to be scared, for those Yankees are certainly no friends of yours," said Mrs. Murray. "But don't you worry," said the massa reassuringly. "There's not going to be any trouble." Even Tom had to laugh when Matilda described the scene, and he shared with the family another laugh when he told them how he had heard that a stable hand in Melville Township had handled the ticklish matter. Asked by his massa whose side he'd be on if a war came, the stable hand had said, "You seed 2 dogs fightin' over a bone, massa? Well, us be's dat bone." Christmas, then New Year's, came and went, with hardly any thought of festivity throughout Alamance County. Every few days Tom's customers would arrive with news of secessions by still more among the southern states, first Mississippi, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, all during the month of January 1861, and on the first day of February, Texas. And all of them proceeded to join a confederacy of southern states headed by their own president, a man named Jefferson Davis. "Dat Massa Davis and whole passels of other southern senators, congressmen, and high mens in the army," Tom reported to the family, "is resignin' to come on back home." "Tom, it's done got closer'n dat to us," exclaimed Matilda. "A man come today and told Massa dat old Jedge Ruffin leavin' Haw River tomorrow to tend a big peace conference in dat Washington, D.C. But a few days later Tom heard his blacksmithing customers saying that Judge Ruffin had returned sadly reporting the peace conference a failure, ending in explosive arguments between the younger delegates from the North and the South. A black buggy driver then told Tom that he had learned firsthand from the Alamance County courthouse janitor that a mass meeting of nearly 1,400 local white men had been held, with Massa Murray among them, Tom knew, and that Massa Holt, Irene's former owner, and others as important, had shouted that war must be averted and pounded tables calling anyone who would join the Confederates traitors. The janitor also told him that a Massa Giles Mebany was elected to take to a seat secession convention the 4-1 vote in Alamance County to remain within the Union. It became hard for the family to keep up with all that was reported each night either by Tom or Matilda. On a single day in March, news came that President Lincoln had been sworn in, that a Confederate flag had been unveiled at a huge ceremony in Montgomery, Alabama, and that the Confederacy's president, Jeff Davis, had declared the African slave trade abolished. Feeling as they knew he did about slavery, the family couldn't understand why. Only days later, tension rose to a fever pitch with the announcement that the North Carolina legislature had called for an immediate 20,000 military volunteers. Early on the Friday morning of April 12, 1861, Massa Murray had driven off to a meeting in the town of Mebany, and Lewis, James, Ashford, Lil Kizzy, and Mary were out in the field, busily transplanting young tobacco shoots when they began to notice an unusually large number of white riders passing along the road at a full gallop. When one rider briefly slowed, angrily shaking his fist in their direction and shouting at them something they couldn't understand, Virgil sent Lil Kizzy racing from the fields to tell Tom, Matilda, and Irene that something big must have happened. The usually calm Tom lost his temper when Kizzy could tell him no more than she did. "Shouted what at y'all?" he demanded, but she could only repeat that the horsemen had been too far away for them to hear clearly. "I better take the mule and go find out," Tom said. "But you ain't got a travelin' pass," shouted Virgil as he went riding down the driveway. "Got to take that chance," Tom shouted back. By the time he reached the main road, it was starting to resemble a racetrack, and he knew that the riders must be headed for company shops, where the telegraph office received important news over wires strung high atop poles. As they raced along, some of the horsemen were exchanging shouts with each other, but they didn't seem to know much more than he did. As he passed poor whites and blacks running on foot, Tom knew the worst had happened, but his heart clenched anyway when he reached the railroad repair yard settlement and saw the great jostling crowd around the telegraph office. Leaping to the ground and tethering his mule, he ran in a wide circle around the edge of the mob of angrily gesturing white men who kept glancing up at the telegraph wires as if they expected to see something come over the wires. Off to one side he reached a cluster of blacks and heard what they were jabbering. "Massa Linkum show gon' fight over us now. Look like de Lord care somethin' 'bout after all. Just can't believe it. Free, Lord, free." Drawing one old man aside, Tom learned what had happened. South Carolina troops were firing on the federal Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and 29 other federal bases in the South had been seized on the orders of President Davis. The war had actually begun. Even after Tom returned home with the news, arriving safely before the massa got home, the Black Grapevine was almost choked with bulletins for weeks. After 2 days of siege, they learned Fort Sumter had surrendered with 15 dead on both sides, and over 1,000 slaves were sandbagging the entrances to Charleston Harbor. After informing President Lincoln that he would get no North Carolina troops, North Carolina Governor John Ellis had pledged thousands with muskets to the Confederate Army. President Davis asked all Southern white men between 18 and 35 to volunteer to fight for up to 3 years, and ordered that of each 10 male slaves on any plantation, 1 should be turned over for unpaid war labor. General Robert E. Lee resigned from the Army of the United States to command the Army of Virginia, and it was claimed that every government building in Washington, D.C. was thick with armed soldiers and iron and cement barricades in fear of Southern invasion forces. White men throughout Alamance County, meanwhile, were lining up by the scores to sign up and fight. Tom heard from a black wagon driver that the massa had called in his most trusted big house servant and told him, "Now, boy, I'm expecting you to look out after missus and the children till I get back, you hear?" And a number of neighboring whites dropped in to shoe up their horses before assembling at Mebany Township with the rest of the newly formed Hawfields Company of Alamance County to board the train that waited to take them to a training camp at Charlotte. A black buggy driver who had taken his massa and his missy there to see off their eldest son described the scene for Tom, the womenfolk bitterly weeping, their boys leaning from the train's windows, making the air ring with rebel yells, many of them shouting, "Going to ship those sons of bitchin' Yankees and be back before breakfast." Young massa, said the buggy driver, had on his new gray uniform, and he was a-cryin' just hard as ol' massa and missy was, and they commenced to kissin' and huggin' till they finally just kind of broke apart from one another just standin' in the road clearin' they's throats and snifflin'. Ain't no need me tellin' no lie, I was a-cryin' too. Chapter 111. Within their lamp-lit cabin late that night, now for a second time Tom sat by the bed with Irene, convulsively gripping his hand, and when abruptly her moans of suffering and labor advanced to a piercing scream, he went bolting outside to get his mother. But despite the hour, intuitively Matilda had not been asleep and also had heard the scream. He met her already rushing from her cabin, shouting back over her shoulder at a bug-eyed little Kizzy and Mary, "Boil some kittles of water and get it to me quick." Within the next few moments, the other adults of the family had also popped from their cabins, and Tom's 5 brothers joined his nervous pacing and wincing while the sounds of Irene's anguish continued. In the first streaks of dawn, when an infant's shrill cry was heard, Tom's brothers converged upon him, pounding his back, wringing his hands, even Ashford. Then in a little while a grinning Matilda stepped through the cabin door, exclaiming, "Tom, you got another little old gal." After a while there in the brightening morning, first Tom, then the rest of the family became a procession trooping in to see the wan but smiling Irene and the crinkly-faced brown infant. Matilda had taken the news into the big house, where she hurriedly cooked breakfast, and right after Massa and Mrs. Murray finished eating, they also came to the Slave Row to see with delight the new infant born into their ownership. Tom readily agreed to Irene's wish to name this second daughter Ellen, after Irene's mother. He was so jubilant that he had become a father again that he didn't remember until later how much he had wanted a boy. Matilda waited until the next afternoon to drop by the blacksmithing shop. "Now, Tom, you know what I'm thinking 'bout?" she asked. Smiling at her, Tom said, "You late, Mammy. I done already told everybody." and was fixin' to tell you to come squeeze in the cabin this comin' Saturday night, and I's gonna tell this child a family story just like I done with Maria when she born." As planned, the family did gather, and Tom continued the tradition that had been passed down from the late Grandmammy Kizzy and Chicken George, and there was much joking afterward that if ever anyone among them should neglect to relate the family chronicle to any new infant, they could surely expect to hear from the ghost of Grandmammy Kizzy. But even the excitement of Tom and Irene's second child soon diminished as a war's swiftly paced events gained momentum. As Tom busily shod horses and mules and made and repaired tools, he kept his ears strained to hear every possible scrap of the exchanges of talk among white customers gathered before his shop, and he winced with disappointment at their successive jubilant reports of Confederate triumphs. Particularly a battle the white men called Bull Run had set the white customers hollering, beating each other's backs and throwing their hats into the air as they shouted such things as "What Yankees wasn't left dead or hurt run for their lives," or "Soon's Yankees hears our boys comin', they shows they asses." The jubilance was repeated over a big Yankee loss at a Wilson's Creek in Missouri. Then not long after, when at a Ball's Bluff in Virginia, hundreds of Yankees were left dead, including a bullet-riddled general who had been a close personal friend of President Lincoln. Dem white mens was all jumpin' up and down and laughin' at President Lincoln heard it and commenced to cryin' like a baby, Tom told his somber family. By the end of 1861, when Alamance County had sent 12 companies off into the various fighting, he hated to report more than a little of what he was continuing to hear, for it only deepened his family's gloom, along with his own. "Lawd knows sho don't sound like we's gonna get free. Keep goin' like this," said Matilda, glancing about one late Sunday afternoon semicircle of downcast faces. No one made any comment for a long while. Then Lily Sue said, as she nursed her sickly son Uriah, "All dat freedom talk, I done just give up any mo' hope." Then a spring 1862 afternoon, when a rider came cantering down the Murray driveway, wearing the Confederate officer's gray uniform, even from some distance he seemed vaguely familiar to Tom. As the rider drew nearer, with a shock Tom realized that it was the former county sheriff Cates, the feed store owner, whose counsel to Massa Murray had forced Chicken George to leave the state. With growing apprehension, Tom saw Cates dismount and disappear within the big house. Then before long Matilda came hurrying to the blacksmith shop, her brows furrowed with worry. "Massa want you, Tom. He talkin' with that no-good feed store, Massa Cates. What you reckon dey wants?" Tom's mind had been racing with possibilities, including having heard his customers saying that many planters had taken slaves to battles with them, and others had volunteered the war services of their slaves who knew trades, especially such as carpentry, leatherworking, and blacksmithing. But he said as calmly as he could, "Just don't know, mammy. I go find out is the best thing, I reckon." Composing himself, Tom walked heavily toward the big house. Massa Murray said, "Tom, you know Major Cates." "Yassa." Tom did not look at Cates, whose gaze he could feel upon him. "Major Cates tells me he's commanding a new cavalry unit being trained at company shops, and they need you to do their horseshoeing." Tom swallowed. He heard his words come with a hollow sound. "Massa, dat mean I go to de war?" It was Cates who scornfully answered, "No, will go anywhere I'm fighting. To fly if they as much as hear a bullet. We just need you to shoe horses where we're training." Tom gulped his relief. "Yassa. The Major and I have discussed it," said Massa Murray. "You'll work a week for his cavalry, then a week here for me, for the duration of the war, which it looks like won't be long." Massa Murray looked at Major Cates. "When would you want him to start?" "Tomorrow morning, if that's all right, Mr. Murray." "Why, certainly, it's our duty for the South," said Massa Murray briskly, seeming pleased at his chance to help the war effort. "I hope the understands his place," said Cates. "The military is no soft plantation. Tom knows how to conduct himself, I'm sure." Massa Murray looked his confidence at Tom. "Tonight I'll write out a traveling pass and let Tom take one of my mules and report to you tomorrow morning." "That's fine," Cates said. Then he glanced at Tom. We've got horseshoes, but you bring your tools, and I'll let you know we want good, quick work. We've got no time to waste. Yassa. Carrying a hastily assembled portable horseshoeing kit on the mule's back, when Tom approached the railroad repair settlement at company shops, he saw the previously lightly wooded surrounded acres now dotted with long, orderly rows of small tents. Closer, he heard bugles sounding and the flat cracking of muskets being fired. Then he tensed when he saw a mounted guard galloping toward him. "Don't you see this is the army?" "Where do you think you're headed?" the soldier demanded. "Major Cates done told me come here and shoe hosses," Tom said nervously. "Well, the cavalry's over yonder," the guard pointed. "Git, before you get shot." Booting the mule away, Tom soon came over a small rise and saw 4 lines of horsemen executing maneuvers and formations, and behind the officers who were shouting orders he distinguished Major Cates wheeling and prancing on his horse. He was aware when the major saw him there on the mule and made a gesture, whereupon another mounted soldier came galloping in his direction. Tom reined up and waited. "You the blacksmith?" "Yassa." The guard pointed toward a small cluster of tents. "You'll stay and work down by those garbage tents. Soon as you get set up, we'll be sending horses." The horses in dire need of new metal shoes came in an unending procession across Tom's first week of serving the Confederate cavalry, and from first dawn until darkness fell, he shod them until the underside of hooves seemed to become a blur in his mind. Everything he overheard the young cavalrymen say made it sound even more certain that the Yankees were being routed in every battle, and it was a weary, disconsolate Tom who returned home to spend a week serving the regular customers for Massa Murray. He found the women of Slave Row in a great state of upset. Through the previous full night and morning, Lily Sue's sickly son Uriah had been thought lost. Only shortly before Tom's return, Matilda, while sweeping the front porch, had heard strange noises, and investigating she had found the tearful, hungry boy hiding under the big house. "I was just trying to hear what Massa and Missy was sayin' 'bout freeing us, but under there I couldn't hear nothin' at all," Uriah had said. And now both Matilda and Irene were busily trying to comfort the embarrassed and distraught Lily Sue, whose always strange child had caused such a commotion. Tom helped to calm her, then described to the family his own week's experience. "Ain't hardly nothin' I seed or hear'd make it look no better," he concluded. Irene tried a futile effort to make them all feel at least a little better. "Ain't never been free, so ain't gonna miss it nohow," she said. But Matilda said, "Tell you all the truth, I's just plain scairt somehow us gonna wind up worse off'n we was befo'." The same sense of foreboding pervaded Tom as he began his second week of horseshoeing for the Confederate cavalry. During the third night, as he lay awake, thinking, he heard a noise that seemed to be coming from one of the adjoining garbage tents. Nervously Tom groped, and his fingers grasped his blacksmithing hammer. He tipped out into the faint moonlight to investigate. He was about to conclude that he had heard some foraging small animal when he glimpsed the shadowy human figure backing from the garbage tent, starting to eat something in his hands. Tipping closer, Tom completely surprised a thin, sallow-faced white youth. In the moonlight for a second, they stared at each other, before the white youth went bolting away. But not 10 yards distant, the fleeing figure stumbled over something that made a great clatter as he recovered himself and disappeared into the night. Then armed guards who came rushing with muskets and lanterns saw Tom standing there holding his hammer. "What you stealin'?" Tom sensed instantly the trouble he was in. To directly deny the accusation would call a white man a liar, even more dangerous than stealing. Tom all but babbled in his urgency of knowing that he had to make them believe him. "Heard somethin' and come lookin' and seed a white man in de garbage, massa, and he broke and run." Exchanging incredulous expressions, the 2 guards broke into scornful laughter. "We look that dumb to you?" demanded one. "Major Cates said keep special eye on you. You're going to meet him soon's he wakes up in the morning, boy." Keeping their gazes fixed on Tom, the guards held a whispered consultation. The second guard said, "Boy, drop that hammer." Tom's fist instinctively clenched the hammer's handle. Advancing a step, the guard leveled his musket at Tom's belly. "Drop it." Tom's fingers loosed and he heard the hammer thud against the ground. The guards motioned him to march ahead of them for quite a distance, before commanding him to stop in a small clearing before a large tent where another armed guard stood. "We're on patrol and caught this stealin'," said one of the first two and nodded toward the large tent. "We'd have took care of him, but the major told us to watch him and report anything to him personal. We'll come back time the major gets up." The two guards left Tom being scowled at by the new one, who rasped, "Lay down flat on your back. If you move, you're dead." Tom lay down as directed. The ground was cold. He speculated on what might happen, pondered his chances of escape, then the consequences if he did. He watched the dawn come. Then the first two guards returned as noises within the tent said that Major Cates had risen. One of the guards called out, "Permission to see you, Major?" "What about?" Tom heard the voice growl from within. "Last night caught that blacksmith stealing, sir." There was a pause. "Where is he now?" "Prisoner right outside, sir." "Coming right out." After another minute, the tent flap opened, and Major Cates stepped outside and stood eyeing Tom as a cat would a bird. "Well, highfalutin', tell me you been stealin'. You know how we feel about that in the army." "Massa," passionately Tom told the truth of what had happened, ending, "He was mighty hungry, massa, rummagin' in de garbage." "Now you got a white man eating garbage. You forget we've met before, plus I know you're kind. Took care of that no-good free pappy of yours, but you slipped loose. Well, this time I got you under the rules of war." With incredulous eyes, Tom saw Cates go striding to snatch a horsewhip hanging from the pommel of his saddle atop a nearby post. Tom's eyes darted, weighing escape, but all three guards leveled their muskets at him as Cates advanced. His face contorted. Raising the braided whip, he brought it down lashing like fire across Tom's shoulders, again. When Tom went stumbling back in humiliation and fury to where he had been shoeing the horses, uncaring what might happen if he was challenged, he seized his kit of tools, sprang onto his mule, and did not stop until he reached the big house. Massa Murray listened to what had happened, and he was reddened with anger as Tom finished. "Don't care what, massa, I ain't going back." "You all right now, Tom?" "I ain't hurt none, 'cept in my mind, if that's what you mean, suh." "Well, I'm going to give you my word. If the major shows up wanting trouble, I'm prepared to go to his commanding general, if necessary. I'm truly sorry this has happened. Just go back out to the shop and do your work." Massa Murray hesitated. "Tom, I know you're not the oldest, but Mrs. Murray and I regard you as the head of your family, and we want you to tell them that we look forward to us all enjoying the rest of our lives together just as soon as we get these Yankees whipped. They're nothing but human devils." "Yassa," Tom said. He thought that it was impossible for a massa to perceive that being owned by anyone could never be enjoyable. As the weeks advanced into the spring of 1862, Irene again became pregnant, and the news that Tom heard daily from the local white men who were his customers gave him a feeling that Alamance County seemed within the quiet center of a hurricane of war being fought in other places. He heard of a battle of Shiloh where Yankees and Confederates had killed or injured nearly 40,000 apiece of each other, until survivors had to pick their way among the dead, and so many wounded needed amputations that a huge pile of severed human limbs grew in the yard of the nearest Mississippi hospital. That one sounded like a draw, but there seemed no question that the Yankees were losing most of the major battles. Near the end of August, Tom heard jubilant descriptions of how in a second battle of Bull Run, the Yankees had retreated with 2 generals among their dead, and thousands of their troops straggling back into Washington, D.C., where civilians were said to be fleeing in panic as clerks barricaded federal buildings, and both the treasuries and the bank's money was being shipped to New York City while a gunboat lay under steam in the Potomac River, ready to evacuate President Lincoln and his staff. Then at Harper's Ferry, hardly 2 weeks later, a Confederate force under General Stonewall Jackson took 11,000 Yankee prisoners. "Tom, I just don't want to hear no mo' about this terrible war," said Irene one evening in September as they sat staring into their fireplace after he had told her of 2 3-mile-long rows of Confederate and Yankee soldiers having faced and killed each other at a place called Antietam. I sits here with my belly full of our third youngin', and it somehow just don't seem right that all us ever talks about anymore is just fightin' and killin'." Simultaneously then they both glanced behind them at the cabin door, having heard a sound so slight that neither of them paid it any further attention. But when the sound came again, now nearly a faint knock, Irene, who sat closer, got up and opened the door, and Tom's brow raised hearing a white man's pleading voice. "Begging pardon, you got anything I can eat? I'm hungry." Turning about, Tom all but fell from his chair, recognizing the face of the white youth he had surprised among the garbage cans at the cavalry post. Quickly controlling himself, suspicious of some trick, Tom sat rigidly, hearing his unsuspecting wife say, "Well, we ain't got nothin' but some cold cornbread left from supper. Sure would 'preciate that. I ain't hardly et in 2 days." Deciding that it was only bizarre coincidence, Tom now rose from his chair and moved to the door. "Been doing a little more'n just begging, ain't you?" For half a moment the youth stared quizzically at Tom. Then his eyes flew wide. He disappeared so fast that Irene stood astounded. And she was even more so when Tom told her whom she had been about to feed. The whole of Slave Row became aware of the incredible occurrence on the next night when, with both Tom and Irene among the family gathering, Matilda mentioned that just after breakfast some scrawny white boy had suddenly appeared at the kitchen screen door piteously begging for food, and she had given him a bowl of leftover cold stew for which he had thanked her profusely before disappearing. Then later she had found the cleaned bowl sitting on the kitchen steps. After Tom explained who the youth was, he said, "Since you feedin' him, I spec he's still hangin' round. Probably just sleepin' somewhere out in the woods. I don't trust him nohow. First thing we know, somebody be in trouble." "Ain't it de truth?" exclaimed Matilda. "Well, I tell you one thing, if he show me his face again, I gonna ax him to wait, and let him believe I's fixin' him somethin' while I goes and tells massa." The trap was sprung perfectly when the youth reappeared the following morning. Alerted by Matilda, Massa Murray hurried through the front door and around the side of the house as Matilda hastened back to the kitchen in time to overhear the waiting youth caught by total surprise. "What are you hanging around here for?" demanded Massa Murray, but the youth neither panicked nor even seemed flustered. "Mister, I'm just wore out from travelin' and stayin' hungry. You can't hold that 'gainst no man, and you're been good enough to feed me something." Massa Murray hesitated, then said, "Well, I can sympathize, but you ought to know how hard the times are now, so we can't be feeding extra mouths. You just have to move on." Then Matilda heard the youth's voice abjectly pleading, "Mister, please let me stay. I ain't scared of no work. I just don't want to starve. I'll do any work you got." Massa Murray said, "There's nothing for you here to do. My work the fields. I was born and raised in the fields. I'll work harder in your mister, to just eat regular," the youth insisted. "What's your name and where you come here from, boy?" "George Johnson, from South Carolina, sir. The war pretty near tore up where I lived. I tried to join up, but they said I'm too young. I'm just turned 16. War ruined our crops and everything so bad, looked like even no rabbits left. And I left too, figured somewhere, anywhere else, had to be better. But seemed like the only somebody even give me the time of day been your..." Matilda could sense that the youth's story had moved Massa Murray. Incredulously then she heard, "Would you know anything at all about being an overseer?" "Ain't never tried that." The George Johnson youth sounded startled. Then he added hesitantly, "But I told you ain't nothing I won't try." Matilda eased yet closer to the edge of the screen door to hear better in her horror. "I've always liked the idea of an overseer, even though my do a good job raising my crops. I'd be willing to try you out for just bed and board to start, to see how it works out." "Mister, sir, what's your name?" "Murray," the massa said. "Well, you got yourself an overseer, Mr. Murray." Matilda heard the massa chuckle. He said, "There's an empty shed over behind the barn you can move into. Where's your stuff?" "Sir, all the stuff I've got on," said George Johnson. The shocking news spread through the family with a thunderbolt's force. "Just couldn't believe what I was hearin'," exclaimed Matilda. ending her incredible report, and the family's members fairly exploded. "Massa must be goin' crazy. Ain't we run his place fine ourselves? Just 'cause they both white, that's all. 'Spect he gonna see dat po' cracker different time we sees it 'nuff things go wrong." But as furious as they were, from their first direct confrontation with the impostor out in the field on the following morning, he immediately made it difficult for their anger to remain at a fever pitch. Already out in the field, when they arrived, led by Virgil, the scrawny, sallow George Johnson came walking to meet them. His thin face was reddened, and his Adam's apple bobbed as he said, "I can't blame y'all none for hatin' me, but I can ask y'all to wait a little to see if I turn out as bad as y'all think. You the first I ever had anything to do with, but seem like to me y'all got black same as I got white, and I judge anybody by how they act. I know one thing, y'all fed me when I was hungry, and it was plenty of white folks hadn't. Now seem like Mr. Murray got his mind set on having an overseer. And I know y'all could help him get rid of me, but I figure you do that, you be taking your chances, the next one he get might be a whole lot worse." None of the family seemed to know what to say in response. There seemed nothing to do except filter away and set to work. All of them covertly observing George Johnson proceeding to work as hard as they, if not harder. In fact, he seemed obsessed to prove his sincerity. Tom's and Irene's third daughter, Viney, was born at the end of the newcomer's first week. By now, out in the field, George Johnson boldly sat down with the members of the family at lunch times, appearing not to notice how Ashford conspicuously got up, scowling, and moved elsewhere. "Y'all see I don't know nothin' about overseein', so y'all needs to help me get along," George Johnson told them frankly. "It would be no good for Mr. Murray to come out here and figure I ain't doin' the job like he want." The idea of training their overseer amused even the usually solemn Tom when it was discussed in the slave row that night, and all agreed that the responsibility naturally belonged to Virgil, since he had always run the field work. "First thing," he said to George Johnson, "you gonna have to change whole lot of yo' ways, 'cause with all us lookin' all the time, massa ain't likely to get close fo' us can give you a signal. Then you have to hurry up and get way from too close round us. Reckon you knows white folks, and specially overseers, ain't supposed to seem like they's close wid. Well, in South Carolina, where I come from, seem like the never got too close to white folks," George Johnson said. "Well, them is smart," said Virgil. "The next thing, a massa want to feel like his overseer making his work harder'n they did before the overseer come. You gotta learn how to holler, 'Get to work, you,' and sich as that. And any time you's around massa or any mo' white folks, don't never call us by our names the way you does. You gotta learn how to growl and cuss and sound real mean to make massa feel like you ain't too easy and got us goin'." When Massa Murray did next visit his fields, George Johnson made strong efforts, hollering, cursing, even threatening everyone in the field, from Virgil down. "Well, how are they doing?" asked Massa Murray. "Pretty fair for been on their own," George Johnson drawled, "but I spec another week or two ought to get 'em shaped up all right." The family rocked with laughter that night, imitating George Johnson, along with Massa Murray's evident pleasure. Afterward, when the mirth had waned, George Johnson quietly told them how it had been to be dirt poor for all of his earlier life, even before his family had been routed with their fields ruined by the war, until he had sought some new, better life. "He 'bout the only white man we ever gonna meet that's just plain honest 'bout hisself," Virgil expressed their collective appraisal. "I tell the truth, I joys listenin' to him talk," said Lily Sue, and Lil George scoffed. "He talk like any other cracker. What make him different, he the first one I ever seen ain't try to act like somethin' he wasn't. The most is so shame of what they is." Mary laughed. "Well, this one ain't shame, not long as he keep eatin' the way he is." "Sound like to me y'all done really taken a likin' to old George," said Matilda. More laughter rose at their homemade overseer's new nickname, Old George, since he was so ridiculously young. And Matilda was correct. Incredibly enough, they had come to like him genuinely.